For decades, more passengers traveled through Atlanta than any other airport in the world, and that's been thanks to in part clever designs as well as some really good choices. But that's now no longer the case. Despite its historic successes and booming demand for travel, Atlanta has just lost its crown, and if we take a good look at this airport, we'll see that its slow downfall shouldn't have come as a surprise. Motion never really stops at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Every 2 minutes, a jet roars into the sky, lands back onto its concrete, whilst loads of others taxis in and out through its myriads of connected taxiways. It's a well-rehearsed process that allows tens of thousands of people to cross paths and get on to where they're going. The title of busiest airport in the world has belonged to Atlanta almost every year since the late 1990s, and for a long time it wasn't really a close race either. Atlanta was the busiest by a really comfortable margin. So, what has happened? What has changed? Well, to explain that, I'm going to hand over to Ben, the creator of Airline Pilot Performance, fellow captain and my co-host, both here on the Now channel and over on Captain Speaking.
Thanks, Petter. And that's actually a really good question. And the first area that I think we should look at is, out of all of the global airports, why Atlanta? What made this particular city and airport so special? Well, for an airport to even be in the running for the title of the world's busiest, it has to be big. And Atlanta has that covered. 5 runways, 7 concourses, and a lot of moving equipment. But with that said, it doesn't really make it any different from other big hub airports in the US or elsewhere for that matter. However, in practice, it's a machine that has historically connected more cities, more people, and more flights than anywhere else on Earth. If you live in the United States, chances are that you've changed planes here, maybe without realizing the scale of what's around you. Each day, more than 250,000 passengers pass through its gates. For most, Atlanta isn't the destination, it's just a hinge between where they are and where they're going.
Yeah, but that constant motion must surely come with a cost, right?
You're not wrong. The very factors that made Atlanta number one, like its geography, its design and its airline partnerships, are now pushing the airport beyond its breaking point. Today, Hartsfield-Jackson isn't just busy anymore, it's full. And that's because its own growth created a demand so great that it's now struggling to keep up with it, at least until the recent government shutdown.
So, how did one airport in the state of Georgia rise to such global dominance? And crucially, can it stay close to the top now as the skies are getting even more crowded?
Well, to answer that question, we have to turn to Atlanta, the city. Atlanta's story as an aviation powerhouse began with a simple decision: to build up, not out. You see, other major cities worldwide chose to spread their air traffic across multiple airports. For example, New York has JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark. Paris has Charles de Gaulle and Orly, and London has Heathrow and Gatwick, not to mention London City closer in, or Stansted and Luton further out. But even though Atlanta went big on air travel, it placed all its bets on that one single airport at the southern edge of its city. And for a long time, that gamble paid off way better than most observers thought possible. I already mentioned geography, and this is a key factor in Atlanta Airport's rise. Draw a circle around the continental United States, and Atlanta sits almost exactly in the center of the busiest half of it. 80% of Americans live within a 2-hour flight. And for airlines, that meant one thing: efficiency. A passenger could fly from almost anywhere in the eastern US to Atlanta, and from there connect to pretty much anywhere else in the world. For cargo, the same advantages applied. The city was perfectly placed for hub operations because it was close enough to every major market, but in a location that helps it avoid the worst of the winter storms that routinely cripple airports in Chicago, New York, and Boston. Atlanta's mild climate avoids the snow and de-icing delays that plague the northern hubs, and the lack of coastal fog or terrain makes visual and instrument procedures really straightforward. But there's another subtle but crucial detail in that location. Atlanta is far enough from other major metro areas that it avoids airspace bottlenecks. While places like New York and Los Angeles are close to other cities, requiring complicated routings to keep planes apart, Atlanta Air Traffic Control all but has the skies to itself. And Delta Airlines was the first to truly exploit that. Long before mergers and alliances reshaped the airline industry, Delta saw that a single centralized hub could unlock nationwide connectivity. Already in the 1980s, its schedule in Atlanta had taken on a rhythmic pattern, with waves of arrivals feeding waves of departures, each connection timed down to the minute. And when deregulation hit, other airlines scrambled to reinvent themselves, whereas Delta simply doubled down on what already worked. The Atlanta hub became the backbone of its domestic network and soon of its growing international one as well, as the airline took over the transatlantic traffic from Pan Am. And by the early 1990s, the model had matured into a finely tuned machine. Flights from small regional airports across the south poured into Atlanta every morning, their passengers spilling into the concourses to make the tight, precisely planned connections onwards to New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, or beyond. And it was the same thing in reverse every evening. The system was efficient, it was profitable, and thanks to Delta's control, remarkably stable. And as Delta grew, so did the airport itself. Hartsfield International, as it was then known, became a living example of synchronized expansion. Every time Delta added new destinations, the airport expanded to match, with new and longer concourses, lengthened taxiways, and more runways. However, it was the 1996 Summer Olympic Games that put the city on the global stage. For the airport, it was the ultimate stress test. In preparation, construction crews worked around the clock to open a brand new international terminal just in time for the Games. That addition allowed the airport to separate international and domestic flows for the very first time, relieving some of the bottlenecks and laying the foundation for Atlanta's future as a truly global hub. And when the athletes and tourists went home, the new infrastructure remained in place and didn't go to waste. For Atlanta, the Olympics weren't a one-time event. They were the catalyst that locked in the airport's long-term growth strategy. Expansion projects didn't stop in the years that followed either. In 2006, the airport opened its fifth runway, a 9,000-foot strip built on an elevated embankment that literally crosses over a massive interstate freeway. Around the same time, the airport completed a new control tower, the tallest in North America, to manage the sprawling airfield that had grown around it. More expansion followed. The new International F Terminal on the airport's east side was built in 2012, dedicated to wide-body aircraft and international travellers and able to handle anything up to an A380. That same year, Delta and its regional affiliates were operating nearly 1,000 daily departures from Atlanta, which is more than some countries' entire national air systems. Atlanta didn't just build an airport, it built an engine. But like any finely tuned machine, that engine can only spin so fast before the parts begin to strain. And I'll explain what this means for the airport's future after this. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about cybersecurity, things like VPNs and staying safe from scams. But what happens when the privacy attacks are totally legal? Well, that's where today's sponsor Delete Me can help. There's an entire industry that makes money by collecting as much information about you as possible and then selling it to anyone who wants it. Advertisers, marketers, and government agencies, to name just a few. Now, this is totally legal, but still exposes you to risk because all of this information can fall into the wrong hands. Delete Me is a subscription service that scans the web and removes your personal information from hundreds of people's search sites. And instead of you manually contacting these data broker sites one by one, which would take hundreds of hours, Delete Me handles it all for you. They take your cybersecurity super seriously. For example, they never outsource to third parties to do this work, relying instead on their own proprietary technology. And unlike other similar services, Delete Me verifies your data is actually being sold before submitting removal requests, which minimizes your exposure. And it's no wonder they're trusted by people who deeply understand privacy risks. Judges, healthcare workers, and journalists who need to protect their sources. Head over to joindeleteme.com/mentor now or scan this QR code to check it out. You'll receive 20% off any plan when you use code MENTORNOW at checkout. Thanks Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. By 2015, Atlanta became the first airport in history to serve over 100 million passengers in a single year. And to understand what this meant for its future, we first need to understand the clever engineering and forward thinking that allowed the airport to reach this size in the first place. The airport sits on roughly 4,700 acres of flat terrain, an ideal canvas for parallel operations. Its 5 east-west runways are aligned almost perfectly with prevailing winds and separated far enough apart to allow triple independent approaches, meaning 3 aircraft can land simultaneously without interfering with each other's wake, which is something that very few airports in the world can do. This gives controllers enormous flexibility. Arrivals can be sequenced into 3 continuous streams, while departures roll on the remaining runways, often with less than 60 seconds between takeoffs. The result is an astonishing throughput, close to 900,000 aircraft movements every single year. Just as important as that, the taxiways and concourses are arranged with the same logic. All 7 terminals run parallel to each other and are connected by train. Every gate links directly to that central spine, so in theory at least, a passenger can travel from one end of the airport to the other in under 10 minutes. And for airline operations, that consistency is gold. Turnaround times are predictable. Crews, maintenance teams and controllers all know exactly where each aircraft type fits. Everything in this airport, from runway separation to concourse geometry, serves one goal: to keep people and aircraft moving. One dominant carrier, one continuous cycle of expansion. Every time demand caught up, the airport managed to stretch just a little further. Another gate, another taxiway, another runway. Yup, the cracks are well and truly showing, and the worry is that they can't be patched fast enough. At peak hours, these neatly arranged concourses are wall to wall with passengers. Security lines stretch into the food courts, and gates areas fill so tightly that the crew sometimes have to delay boarding simply to make room for arriving flights. And this isn't just a perceived problem, the infrastructure itself is maxed out. Airport General Manager Ricky Smith put it bluntly: "Pretty much all of our major amenities are stretched," he says. Restrooms, baggage systems, concessions, even the plane train that shuttles people underground between the concourses are all operating at or above design capacity. Now, before the pandemic, Atlanta processed about 110 million passengers every year. And already in 2024, it got back up to 108 million, and forecasts show demand climbing steadily beyond that to 125 million in the next decade. In practice, that means another 15 million people trying to move through the same corridors, stand in the same security lines, and sit at the same gates.
That all sounds great, but this growth can't continue forever. Are there any cracks in Atlanta starting to show?
That's a good question, and the most obvious pinch point is D Terminal. Built narrower than the rest, it was fine for 727s and MD-80s of the 1980s, but it can't comfortably handle today's 737s and A321s or the crowds that come with them. The airport has begun a massive billion-dollar project to rebuild Terminal D, widening it section by section while keeping flights operating. Ordinarily, the terminal would close to allow this work to go faster, but travel demand is so high that shutting it down just isn't an option, which means that the rebuild will take nearly a decade to complete. And similar problems show up across the airfield. Car parking decks are being torn down and rebuilt, road traffic routinely backs up into the interstate, and behind the scenes, the baggage tunnels that feed the hundreds of claim belts are nearing their physical limits. Even the plane train system that shuttles the passengers between the terminals is undergoing expansion to add more cars and increase frequency because its current schedule just can't keep up with the number of passengers that depend on it. And then there's the much more visible operational fragility. Running at full capacity constantly leaves no margin for error. When weather, equipment failures, or simple bad luck intervene, the effects ripple instantly through the system. The 2017 power outage was a perfect example of this. A fire in an underground electrical vault cut power to the terminals for nearly 11 hours, stranding tens of thousands of people. In any other airport, that would have been a serious disruption, but it would mostly affect the airport itself. In Atlanta, the entire Delta network ground to a halt. The loss of one hub cascaded across the entire country, and the recovery took days. And this is due to Atlanta's status as a fortress hub, something we've actually covered here on the Mentour Now channel before. Even minor disturbances like the frequent summer thunderstorms, temporary runway closures or staffing shortages can compound quickly when every gate is occupied and every slot is spoken for. Controllers describe the airspace around Atlanta as elastic, meaning that it can stretch a bit, but not much. Once it snaps, delays multiply geometrically. So, to move from 110 to 125 million passengers by 2030, as I just mentioned, would mean that the airport needs to process roughly 15% more people. And this time, as we're going to see, there is no additional space to move into. With everything else remaining as is, the growth can only come with denser gate areas, longer queues, and higher utilisation of every system, from jetways to baggage belts. And there's also a human dimension to think of here. Tens of thousands of ground staff, gate agents and controllers are keeping the operation running, but with almost no slack. Ramp crews work through sweltering summer heat and winter storms on 20-minute turnarounds. Delta's operations centre is constantly juggling gate swaps minute by minute to prevent gridlock. And despite all of this effort, the strain at the airport only gets more visible with time. The phrase that keeps surfacing in management meetings is controlled chaos. Everything still functions, but only because everyone involved is constantly compensating. Smith sums up the company's growth plans by saying that a lot of stuff is going to break before we get there. And it's hard to argue that he's exaggerating. As the traffic keeps growing, every weak link from aging electrical systems to undersized concourses becomes a potential failure point. Atlanta built its dominance on reliability, but reliability itself depends on growth potential and capacity margins, two things that Hartsfield-Jackson no longer has. Now, every major city eventually faces the question that Atlanta's forward-thinking design had put off until now. When one airport is full, do you expand it or do you give up and build another one? In Atlanta, the problem is simple. The airport is now boxed in. To the north lies downtown, to the south, growing suburbs, and all around it, businesses and neighbourhoods that depend on its constant activity. So there's no easy way to expand beyond the land it already occupies. City planners have studied the idea of a second airport at least a dozen times. Several possible sites near the city have been floated, but each time the conclusion has been the same. The economics just don't work. But here's the thing, that's mainly because Delta doesn't want them to. Delta's influence in Atlanta is huge. The airline operates roughly 80% of all flights out of Atlanta, making it one of the largest single carrier hubs in the world. This isn't just a matter of giving Delta the room it needs for regional, mainline, domestic and international flights. As a hub, Atlanta allows passengers to transfer freely to and from all of these flights. A second airport would simply split that traffic, reducing the numbers of connections passengers can make, and obviously it would also require duplicate facilities, maintenance bases and staff. Airspace would also get more complicated since the new and the old airport would be close to each other. From Delta's perspective, a new airport in the area would destroy the efficiency that makes Atlanta profitable. When asked, CEO Ed Bastian was blunt. He called it a distraction that would serve a very low-end purpose and undermine what makes Hartsfield-Jackson successful. In other words, as long as Delta dominates the skies over Georgia, our second airport just isn't happening. So how is Atlanta planning to meet the extra demand? Well, it's a good question, and the answer hinges on something called the Atlanta Next program, essentially an attempt to squeeze every remaining ounce of capacity from the existing site. The plan calls for an 8th terminal, a 6th runway, new parking decks, and expansion of all 7 existing terminals. And it will all need to be built while the airport stays open. It's a $20 billion effort to keep one airport doing the job of 2 or 3. The bet is that Atlanta can continue to grow as it stands by renovating, layering and reconfiguring instead of spreading out. But even the airport's leadership admits that all of this is just a stopgap. Given enough time, the demand for air travel through Atlanta may simply exceed what one airfield can handle.
Alright, but Atlanta isn't the only huge global hub out there. How are other cities planning to meet the future demand?
While Atlanta tries to stretch its boundaries, other global hubs have taken a very different approach. They've started over. In Beijing, the traffic crunch at the old Capital International Airport reached crisis levels a decade ago. With more than 80 million passengers a year and air traffic control sectors at saturation, there was no room left to grow. So rather than trying to rebuild around the edges, China built an entirely new airport altogether. Beijing Daxing International Airport opened in 2019. The design capacity of its first phase, which carries a relatively modest 45 million passengers a year, will expand to 100 million once all of the terminals and runways are completed. In one single move, Beijing went from constraints to surplus, future-proofing its role as a global hub for decades. And then there's Dubai, the airport that in November 2025 surpassed Atlanta as the busiest in the world. Well, that's in terms of passenger capacity, because there are other metrics that still favour Atlanta, but only just. Now, to be fair, the US government shutdown definitely affected the airport operations everywhere in the US in November, so Atlanta could potentially steal back that crown, but probably only for a while. But the writing really is on the wall. Surrendering to Dubai for good might just be a matter of time. Dubai's growth strategy is very similar to Beijing's, but even bigger. Dubai International Airport, the home and hub of Emirates, was already handling 86 million passengers before the pandemic, all within 2 runways and limited airspace. The Emirates' answer is Dubai World Central, also known as Al Maktoum International. This will be a brand new airport being built in the desert to eventually handle between 160 million and 260 million travellers a year. And once complete, it will replace DXB entirely. For Dubai and Emirates, the solution to congestion isn't efficiency, it's scale. For other airlines, the solution is to move away from hubs, at least to a point, and build route networks with more direct connections as much as possible. Atlanta, by contrast, is trying to stretch one airport indefinitely, a model that's worked brilliantly for half a century, but one that no other global hub has dared to replicate at this scale. Even Dubai primarily needs to think about long-haul only, not the mix of international, domestic and regional flying that Delta is working with in Atlanta. Hartsfield-Jackson kept the title of the world's busiest airport for nearly 3 decades by focusing and optimizing everything around a key idea. One airport, one hub, one system that just never stops moving. But that strength now boomeranged into an almost insurmountable challenge. The very efficiency that made Atlanta unstoppable has left it with no spare room to grow. Now, if history is any guide, Atlanta and Delta Airlines will adapt. But to stay on top or even near it, both the airline and the city may have to rethink the idea that one airport can handle everything forever. But what do you think? Have you travelled through Atlanta recently? If you're a regular there, have you noticed any changes for the better or for the worse? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentour now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.